for me to somehow say, this is the way this is the way it has to be done. So I'm going to make sure Moxy only develops in this direction. I think that's likely a fail, because I might just be wrong. You get to see these things live in front of you, right? And then you're like, well, this isn't what people told me it was supposed to be. You have time and you have resources. Go collect the data. You go collect the data. I can't collect the ski data for you. I'm not gonna be able to get it. You need to make sure your quality trainings are quality trainings to the maximum and use the Moxy for those. And then you have a certain amount of, let's say, filler training that you do to get volume. But you need to make sure that those filler trainings don't mess up your quality trainings.
Hey, Andri, welcome back to the podcast. How you doing?
Hey, Sean, thanks for having me again. Always like talking to you. It's fun.
We've had a couple chances to exchange since the last podcast. We did a video for your YouTube channel as well, trying to go over a few Moxy graphs and different interpretations of those. So that was pretty fun.
Yeah, that went way off left field. That was like, but no, it was good. It was fun.
I guess it's one of the upside and the downside of I guess what we're looking at is there's room for interpretation, and there's a lot of different theories that can be applied to what we might see, and but it also makes it interesting because it forces you to be critical in the way that you think and see things and maybe potentially uncover things that couldn't have been uncovered without those kind of techs.
Yeah, for sure. And I do, but I mean, I don't think it's different than other technologies that are out there. In that right now, a lot of people using Moxy is kind of first or second adopter type, the early, and those people generally are more critical or not in a negative way, but try to think more about what they're using. And so it generates much more of these discussions where as you go 1 or 2 or 3 layers deep, you realize, well, hey, there's a bunch of questions we need to address here. Those questions are in place with lots of other things that are used on a daily basis with training. But it's more established. You have a lot more people using it that aren't these first or second adopters. They're way down the consumer chain, and then you take things for granted. That's the way it is. Whereas you dig those 2, 3, 4 layers deep, you would find similar discussions. Just because they're not as new the text, and those often don't come up unless you kind of find those niche areas where people are discussing those topics.
Yeah, that makes sense. The first thing I wanted to talk with you about today was the Moxy Portal. So we're now end of March. So the Kickstarter ended about a month ago. Do you have an idea of how things are going on the development side? I know Roger just sent out an update email to let everybody know that the app was underway and that things were slowly starting to move forward.
Yeah. So first of all, super excited. So thanks everyone for supporting that. Super exciting. I mean, we outperformed. We were a little worried because doing a Kickstarter and not having it be successful is a real bummer. So, but it turned out really well, and we got quite a bit we went quite a bit over budget. Well, so we got a lot more than our expected budget. So we should be able to get everything that we want done in time. And right now it's just base layer coding, or like laying the groundwork for the app is what's happening right now. It looks cool.
If we maybe go a couple steps down the line, what are the main features that you're looking forward to? And then maybe if we could talk about some additional features that you'd like to see maybe implemented down the road that you feel might be a good add-on to what will be offered at the beginning.
Yeah. So I had a talk with Raj about this a couple days ago, and so I think the most important features is to get something where people can use the device and access the data easily on a handheld device to kind of really get data in users' hands. And let's say a lot of the maybe more advanced type analysis type features aren't planned right now. I think it's also just try to get something out that's going to work really well instead of adding too many features that just are going to be buggy or just aren't going to work well. And the idea is also then to try to get lots of feedback from users, because it'll be something where we should be able to get more interaction with users. Also, like the Moxy backers portal, I hope people keep writing in features that they'd like to discuss. I'm definitely going to put some more ideas up there. And I do think then features, you're open for a lot of different types of features. And obviously the features that I think about are like analysis type features, because that's what I do. I want to know what the data is telling me. So those are the features that I always think about. Now, I think there's room for features that aren't on that level, right? That is more about usability features. And one of the coolest ones that should be implemented for the app release already is that you can track someone else's data, because the data is always going to be updated to your phone and then to the cloud. And if I have access to your profile in the Moxy Portal, I can then go look at what Sean's doing, and I can track your training live, and that can be across the world, right? So I think that's really cool for coaches to track data. You can see athletes, what they're doing live or after a workout. I think that's really useful. That's one of the cool features that should get implemented rather quickly that I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, can we go into maybe the more advanced ones that you'd like to see implemented down the line, potentially on the web tool to analyze the data?
So like analysis features, yes, there's a couple things that we've talked about. I mean, one of the things are always is a topic of my PhD, which is somehow trying to assess time to failure, time to exhaustion, based on change in NIRS data. So I'm hoping to get some code out that we might be able to put into some beta versions of an app. Maybe this year. We'll see how things go. But the idea of the first versions would definitely be to try to get enough people to still give us data so we can optimize more and more. I've got some projects open with some universities in the UK that are collecting lots and lots of data on time to failure. I sent a couple of Moxys, sent 5 Moxys to the UK to get data collected to help optimize the model. So that's one of the things, but I think that's maybe a little bit further off. Some other more advanced features are things like being able to directly compare 2 sensors. I think I put that on the Moxy backers forum. So like you can put a right and a left. Yeah, and then instead of just having 2 Moxys where they gives you the value for both, then you're comparing, to have a directer connection between the 2, where it's more like a difference between the right and the left. You can see that analysis closer about like right and left asymmetries or something like that. And maybe one of the other things that I haven't talked about that I'm putting together with a project with Rocky Mountain University and University of Wollongong, at least they've committed and said they'd be interested, is trying to get like lots and lots of Moxy data together and create some normative tables, which is something that could be put into an app as well. So kind of like, because people always ask, well, what is normal data for my Moxy? It's kind of hard. Yeah. Because normal is a weird word. But yeah, we definitely just have kind of like based on biological sex and age groups to have some normative data, and there's pretty good correlations between, for example, VO2 peak and maximal oxygen desaturation, or SMO2 difference, and having things like that. So you can definitely, if you were to do some incremental cycling test or running test, and you look at your SMO2 values, you can make a prediction to what your systemic VO2 is. That's somewhat accurate with certain variability. So I think that's cool. And then you can look at, what is my SMO2 values, where's my age group, my gender, where do I sit, and you can kind of do some kind of fitness assessing in a pretty simple way, which is kind of cool. I think that's pretty cool. So that's a lot of years and years of data that's getting put into that.
Those tables would be really useful, because like we said at the beginning, right now you look at a graph and you have trends and you have numbers, and you don't have anything to compare them to necessarily. You just have to know how to interpret what you see, but then there's no reference points as to like you said, what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, why, in which context, and what should we see, etc. So I think what you just mentioned would be really good, but it would take a lot of work to put all that together and then include that as a reference, I guess.
Yeah, we'll see. But those things I think are kind of the type of features where we get data in and try to help people. And one of the obvious ones that I've always wanted to implement is you can do. I'm kind of pro and against it because it kind of, I don't know, goes against some of my principles. But I know you got to do what the customers want. But people always ask about threshold testing. So you could automate threshold testing with your NIRS device. Just do some regressions. So that's something that could also get implemented, that you can just do your own testing at home on, and it spits out some training zones for you.
That's interesting because, as you said, that might go against some of your current principles
Yeah.
or ways of seeing things. Well, maybe let's dig a little bit into this. How do you feel about implementing a feature that, because from my understanding is that there's a lot of information that we have available now that is kind of pulling us away from using those maybe older metrics, or previously relevant metrics that aren't as relevant now as they used to be. Do you think it's almost a step backwards to keep using those rather than just moving forward and finding better information to base our decisions on?
Yeah. So I think if I was maybe more confident in myself or my knowledge, I would say I'd be more willing to say, no, this is the way you have to do it. I generally am the opinion of, you should be somewhat doubtful, and for me to somehow say this is the way this is the way it has to be done. So I'm gonna make sure Moxy only develops in this direction. I think that's likely a fail, because I might just be wrong. I mean, we just might be wrong with some of those ideas, and some of those ideas are very likely wrong, and some of them might be less wrong than others. But it's just the way things work. Generally, people are wrong about things than right, I would say. And so I prefer just to use the technology and the strengths of it and let people kind of apply it the way they want and help them. So if you say, hey, threshold testing is what I want, can the Moxy give me threshold testing? Then I can say, yeah, it seems to be able to do that. So, go ahead and do that. And especially if people have success. I mean, it's somehow me telling them these thresholds are dumb, or even like lactate. Lactate's a dumb measure to do threshold testing. And to a certain extent, I think that's true, but not always. And lots of people have great success. I mean, empirically, people have been successful doing lactate testing. And now I'm going to say that was a fluke, or like, no, it probably did help something with structure and figuring out something about rates of glycolysis. So that's, I guess, why I'm very willing to help people or develop things into a direction where I think, well, maybe that's not the optimal way. But if that's what people want, who am I to tell them they're wrong? So
in the realm of ideas around the NIRS technology in general and everything that is kind of attached to it in a way or another, which ideas are you the most maybe certain about or convinced about, and which ones do you still have? Do you think there's still a lot of room for interpretation in terms of their validity or their applicability or their reliability, as to maybe what has been done for the last 15-20 years? Which one of those would you more easily maybe put aside or try to move forward into another direction rather than still relying on those specific ideas?
Well, I think the most, at least on a personal level, so what NIRS really helped me with is kind of conceptualizing bioenergetics, which I know you've talked about a lot. And these frameworks of bioenergetics, these aerobic, anaerobic, lactic, alactic frameworks. And so you can read the idea that these systems don't work as they're described classically has been around for a long time. I mean, this isn't 2020 stuff. This is, Brooks was doing stuff in the 80s this is definitely a long time coming, that there's probably some analysis that needs to be done here. But NIRS helped me just take it, because I'm a sports scientist and I'm not, let's say, a hardcore physiologist. So I'm very much in this applied world where I'm trying to combine these things together. And NIRS and the Moxy just shows you that that classical bioenergetics, if you think this device measures somewhat accurately, the classical bioenergetics view cannot be right. There's something else going on, because otherwise it's just weird. So I think that's one of the things that I think really changed the way you look at what is lactate, how does bioenergetics works, aerobic, anaerobic. There is no anaerobic, like those types of things. NIRS just opens your eyes real fast. Use a device. I think that's pretty useful. It also helps you. We're going to talk about that after. There's another thing, but maybe you had a question. I don't know. I'm blabbing.
Oh, go. So, you're here. Okay. You're here to blab. That's why I invite you on.
Okay. So the other one is something, because we've talked about this before, and about like the THB response and and that I don't always have such high confidence in my predictability of the THB response. This is also one of the things where it helps, because you have this THB response, and then there's all discussion about what is this THC response supposed to mean. And it's something where, like, initially we did this analysis of this THB response, and like this like classical picture of like how blood flow changes and how it's recruited, right? This like Krogian model where it's really just, you have like one capillary and it's got blood going, and all the other ones aren't active, and then you get some vasodilation over here and it opens up these more capillaries, and this is all like very linear, just happening. But then you get these like really funky THB responses in certain situations. It's beautiful. You can use that idea, and you're like, yeah, this is one-to-one. It's a Krogian model. This is exactly what's happening. And then you get some really funky THB response. So you're like, well, this might not be exactly how things work, right? And then you start to say, well, what does the physiology, the microcirculation say about this? And then you get these discrepancies between like macrocirculation, or like what often sports physiologists do. They look at these big vessels and big blood flow and what's happening in the microcirculation, which isn't the same. And these relationships don't happen linearly. And the Moxy, there's some debate about what the NIRS signal is getting you. But there's some say like that 90% of the NIRS signal is microcirculation. So it's not these big vessels, it's these little vessels, which is also good because that's where all this oxygen transfer is happening. But it also makes it kind of funky because these things don't happen to go the way that the big system would expect it to go. And there's definitely a lot of, and again, NIRS helps you with this because you get to see these things live in front of you, right? And then you're like, well, this isn't what people told me it was supposed to be. I mean, this is what I imagine it was like 40 years ago, or like when handheld lactate analyzers came out, right? And now me as some sports phys guy, I can go ahead and take all these blood lactate measurements, and all of a sudden I realized that 2 and 4 millimole, which were these aerobic, anaerobic threshold values, are just like, I can have 6 millimole sitting here doing nothing, you know? Or I can send some guy and I can't get him to get over 2 millimole, no matter what that dude does. But before, if you read it in a textbook, you're like, oh, this is just what it looks like, and this is what's happening. And then you get tools, you measure stuff yourself, and you're like, oh man, stuff's real dirty. So yeah, maybe.
Do you think that maybe more Moxys on someone could help give more information as to what's going on the blood flow side of things?
Yeah, I definitely think that helps. It can also be more confusing because, I mean, if you have one Moxy and it does exactly what you'd expect it to do, then it's super easy. Your explanation's like there. And if you have two and one of them does what you expect and the other one doesn't, then now you're in trouble. You'd rather just have had one because then you don't have to deal with the other one. But I do think the bigger picture, the more data you're willing to go analyze, the better. Generally, I think you can explain a lot of the THB responses physiologically. And a lot of the times it is predictable. It's not completely unpredictable, but there are more than a few cases where you're going to have trouble explaining the THB response. And with the SMO2, this is much less likely, from my experience.
Do you feel like maybe...
But I do think that, yep, I'll go for it.
Do you feel like adding the ventilatory data might help clear some of the air around those ideas of vasoconstriction and vasodilation from a gas exchange standpoint?
Yeah, I think if the more data you get, it can certainly help. it makes for more in-depth analysis.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I do think that that's useful. And I mean, like breathing alters what you do with in your NIRS signal. So changing up your breathing. So having respiratory information obviously helps because those things are very tightly linked, and those changes can happen very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that is very useful. Yeah, no, more data is better if you're willing to go through it. Yeah.
Is there other data points that you could see being valuable to help interpret the NIRS information at this point in time that maybe is not commonly used or not used at all yet?
So one of the things that we use a lot, so my dad used this a lot because he had one, and so I borrowed it for a substantial period of time. Got to use it, was the physio flow. I don't know if physio flow. So it's a French.
I'm familiar with I'm familiar with it just from the presentation on the I think it's on the Moxy YouTube that you and your dad led a while ago. It's the 2-part one, and you guys talk about the physio flow where your dad really kind of puts forward the model of the limiters and the compensators in the analogy of the rowboat, and with the 4 different systems. And so that's the first time where I saw it, and talking to Brian more recently, then he mentioned that as well. And essentially that the information from the physio flow was able to there was some correlation with the NIRS data, and then so that allowed us to infer some things from the NIRS data without necessarily having the physio flow. But what do you think the physio flow might add? Maybe for those who don't know what the device is and what it gets, what you can get out of it, can you explain what that, and then what would that add to the total picture that we have with NIRS?
Yeah, so the physio, it's a French device. Frank Bohr is a really smart guy. I've had the pleasure of talking to him on numerous occasions. And obviously, like my dad does, he contacted Frank a long time ago, and they actually did quite a bit of work then together. At least my understanding. Also, my dad would give feedback about how everything's working or not working, because that's what he always does. And what it does is it's an impedance device and an ECG together, essentially. And so it changes, it measures volume change, fluid volume change in your thoracic cavity, essentially around your heart. And in this way, it gives you information about the contraction properties of your heart through the ECG, and through blood volume changes in your heart through the impedance. And it kind of like maps these over top of each other. And so it'll give you all of a sudden information like heart rate, of course, but things like stroke volume, because stroke volume has to do with milliliters of blood that your heart's pumping per beat. Or things like left ventricle ejection time. So what phases of the heart contraction your heart's in and how long those are, things like that. And the idea, the limiter idea is that you want to kind of identify these major physiological systems and kind of separate them. And so, like we said, respiratory is important, and we have pulmonary gas exchange measurements to get this kind of respiratory information. So we have that. And then we had the Moxy, was getting you some kind of peripheral muscular information. And then the last piece missing, well, we had heart rate, but heart rate's only like one factor of this whole cardiac system. And so the physio flow gave us a tool that you could get stroke volume out, for example. And it was, it's non-invasive, it's just electrodes. And it's portable. So you could go on the field out and do it. So, and it appears to be valid. Okay. So, I mean, this is often where I'm not in the position to judge how valid something is. I can take measurements, I can assess it based on my knowledge and if it's working, and literature, and then read studies that assume that it's valid enough, for sure. Now, if you're doing real rocky exercise, we had some artifact problems where it get funky, but generally it's a really nice device. I definitely think for sports scientists, because you don't have to do everything non-invasively, if it's valid enough, is better than invasive. So not everyone agrees with me on that, but I think it's nicer to not poke people.
I was going to say, if you can avoid poking people, then they'll probably always be happier. And like you said, if you can get similar information from that, That's always a good thing. I wanted to move forward and talk about. So you talked about you being in the field of the application of what we can draw from NIRS. And one thing that interests me these days is kind of looking at maybe common training methods, popular training methods that are used in different sports, and then looking at them with NIRS to try and better understand them, or to try and determine what the adaptations might be at the physiological level using those different training methods. Is that something you've had a chance to do with in the years that you've used the device, and with the different sports that you've worked with, to try and kind of monitor different training protocols to see what those adaptations were, or what the effects were of different training interventions on the athletes from that physiological standpoint?
Yeah. So I guess maybe as a general comment, maybe for new Moxy users, is definitely, if you have a Moxy, go do the trainings that you've done and that you felt have been successful, or as a trainer, and kind of see what happens. And this is especially useful if you have been applying a training method very successfully on a set of athletes and it didn't work with the other set of athletes. You should go do it on both of them and get in and see if there's a different response. Maybe that helps to try to gain some insight into that. Now, one of the main things that I actually did then with athletes, there's two parts, but one of them is kind of trying to assess HIIT. So like, there's lots of empirical data that high intensity interval training is very effective and can be useful in training. And then there's lots of different methods on like how long do you do sprint intervals? Do you do longer or shorter hits? What are the goals of these? And I think the Moxy can be useful in optimizing those. And so, and this goes with the growing body of literature on this too. I know Laval University, I hope I'm saying that right, in Canada, they have a couple things out with kayakers where they did some research. One where they show that NIRS changes in VO2, that NIRS changes are a better predictor of performance than VO2, which is interesting. But the more interesting one and relevant to the topic is they did some where they did different HIIT sessions and kind of looked at responses. So they did sprint intervals, and they did short hits, and they did long hits. So I think the short hits are 15 or 30 seconds with 1-to-1 rest ratio, and the other ones are longer, a minute or longer. Not quite sure. And so you see things like that the sprint intervals generate much better kind of desaturation if you look at your NIRS data. This is something that I also see. And what you also know from other studies is that sprint intervals are very effective in kind of mitochondrial biogenesis, that they can be used to do this kind of peripheral building. And so that this kind of makes sense, this kind of overlap. So you like, it's in sprints, you're getting the most local oxygen extraction and consumption when you're doing a sprint interval. So maybe if you want to build up the peripheral system, sprint intervals seem to be effective. And NIRS kind of shows us that. And NIRS would show us that if you're in your training, how long you want to do that sprint interval kind of for. It needs to go down as quickly as possible. And when it's not going down anymore, you're probably done with your sprint interval. You're probably done anyways, but let's just put it that way. I mean, it's good if it matches your feeling, I think is a good thing, because if you're way off, that seems to be weird. And then the longer hits, they kind of showed that you'd be better off at the longer ones at maximizing like VO2 max. So like with sprint interval, you never hit VO2 max. You need a longer time. And so this is also something you see with Moxy, is that if you, or with NIRS, is that your VO2 peak or your VO2 max is reached when you get an extended plateau at a low to saturation rate. And this takes time for that extended plateau to build. And so you can say, well, I'm gonna set my times. Also, I need to get a steady desaturation. It's gonna keep coming down. And I want to go find this minimum plateau, and I want to hold that for a period of time. And now I'm doing my VO2 max HIIT sessions. Um, so I don't know if that, I think that's definitely a very applied side of where using Moxy kind of helped me adjust trainings, right? Looking at what's happening during these hit intervals to better optimize training.
Bouncing off of this, thinking about auto-regulation using NIRS during, say, for example, sprints, intervals. One thing that came to my mind recently is maybe playing devil's advocate on the idea of using NIRS to auto-regulate those sprint intervals based on if we can call it a performance threshold or a desaturation threshold, and then a recovery threshold that we want to see reached on every interval. And if we fail to either desaturate to that performance threshold or resaturate to that rest threshold, then we might want to stop the session based on that. Playing devil's advocate on this, I was thinking that maybe what if, it's always what ifs, I guess, but in terms of global load management, obviously it's a big thing now, especially with pro athletes, with big teams, team sports. You have to manage how much training they do, the load that's imposed on them to reduce injuries and make sure they can recover from it. Would auto-regulating with NIRS maybe pull back the total training volume too far back in terms of just doing the effective training volume for that person at that time, in such a way that on the long term, maybe that person can't actually tolerate as much volume of work as they might need in order to excel in the sport? Because we know that there are a lot of sports where, you know, I guess weightlifting is the easiest one to think about, because it's just tonnage over the year, and that is a huge predictor in terms of performance. How much volume can you tolerate over the year to then do well in your competition? So what, in your opinion, would using NIRS for everything maybe pull back that volume too far and not allow for those overall adaptations to occur on the long term for athletes?
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, I do think we need to be careful to not throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? And just be like, I'm doing all on this. I wouldn't do that ever with anything. It's more about minor adjustments over time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And usually what happens then is 10 years down the road, you're like, I knew this in the first year, but I wasn't brave enough. And now I know. And if I would have done it then, well, but you didn't know it then. So what are you going to do? It's not how it works.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I generally think training volume for most athletes isn't a problem. I think I think most athletes do too much volume, assuming motivated athletes, assuming we're not prodding in them. But I think you're usually better off reducing volume and increasing quality.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a truism most of the time. So I think Moxy can help with that. But training volume is a big predictor of performance. And so I do think there's something there. And I think maybe where the Moxy comes in is more, you need to make sure your quality trainings are quality trainings to the maximum and use the Moxy for those. And then you have a certain amount of, let's say, filler training that you do to get volume. But you need to make sure that those filler trainings don't mess up your quality trainings. Okay. It's more like, sense. I almost call them maintenance training. You're doing training. None of this training is to make you better. It's just to make sure you're not getting any worse. And then you have these other specific training blocks where you're like, hey, these need to be perfect because this is where I'm going to make my improvements, right? It kind of goes a little bit like an accumulation intensification type thing, right? Where you really got to make sure, and you do this over the whole year. And, maybe the Moxy also helps you, maybe you identify, hey, this is a time now where I really got to push. The oxygen consumption is really good. They're recovering really well. The feel good performance being maintained. Let's push. And on another day, you see they're really not desaturating. They're not recovering well. They feel crappy. Maybe it's not no training. Maybe it's no training. Sometimes you probably have to decide no training. And sometimes maybe it's just, hey, we're doing some kind of maintenance now. Let's make sure you're ready for the next training session. That's how I would assess it.
when it comes to protocols, using the Moxy, using NIRS in general, protocols for assessing different things. So the common ones might be a 515 or a modified 515 for the, I would call it the overall energetic profile of the athlete when it comes to that VO2. Then there's also protocols that are well described on the Moxy blog by Philip, about repeat sprints, and also about potentially a kind of an occlusion profile on strength work. Is there other, and I also know of the one that I believe you and your father and Brian developed for hockey, that Arno presented on his webinar.
Yeah.
Are there other, can you think of other sport specific protocols that you've seen or that you've done over the years for different sports that can bring some valuable information to the table in terms of assessing athletes using NIRS?
Yes, so a lot of them are protocols you've done. I mean, they're going to seem rather pedestrian, I guess, but it's generally things like, so you take a sport and you assess, hey, what are the demands of that sport? And then you try to reproduce that in a certain protocol. That's how we do it with the hockey. I recently did a data collection with the Lions again, where they did this Mockling test, the repeated ice, what is it called, the repeated intermittent shuttle test. It's RISS. I don't remember what it stands for, but they just do repeated shuttle sprints, and then they take a longer break, and then repeated shuttle sprints, and then they take a longer break. And so we did some analysis with Moxy on that as well. And I think that's useful. I think that's a smart protocol. We did with climbers intermittent holding tests too, where you do we'll do on a fingerboard, and they'll hold for 7 seconds, they'll rest for 3, they'll hold for 7, they'll rest for 3, or even just specific climbing holding for as long as you can to assess changes. Those are all things you can easily do with the Moxy. But none of these are like mind-blowing. Like, I think that the 515, a lot of people felt like, wow, this is something really new, right? For better or for worse. And but I think generally testing protocols to bring up something really new is, you can overdo things. I mean, you can always change. You can just add this, you change this, you make this step longer, make this step shorter, you add a break here. I mean, it's all kind of the same jazz. I think that the more relevant point is, or the most relevant point is bringing the diagnostics to the sport. I think that's what I would say is what I've done over the years, or tried to. Now, there's a big problem with that, which is not to be underestimated, is that you get data for something you don't know what is supposed to happen. So anytime you do a first protocol, you get a response, and the more that protocol is off of what other people have done, the more you don't know what it means.
Mm-hmm. Do you have an example in mind, that something that has happened to you over the years that kind of threw you off a little bit, maybe the first time you did it?
Well, I mean, it's what does throw me off often, it's still now, is, and this happened, one example, this has happened, was that me and my dad, we were in Zermatt with the Swiss national ski team, and we're doing some measurements on an athlete, and we looked at it, and we're looking at data, we're like, okay, this is really cool, look what's happening. They did all these slalom runs, and then we sat down with the coaches, and we like showed them, and then they're like, what does it mean? And we're like, well, this means, and we just started talking about this, could mean this, could this mean the end? There's like, yeah, but I mean, what are you comparing this to or whatever? And we're like, this is the first time we've gathered data on a professional downhill skier doing slalom, right? And like, yeah. I don't even know if any years data like this exists anywhere, like when we did it, right? So, yeah. And then you look like an idiot because you're just playing with a gadget, right? Essentially, they're just like, well, it's just a gadget, and what you can do, right? And we were trying to say, hey, isn't this blowing your mind? We're measuring changes in oxygen in your muscle while you're on the ski slope. And they weren't so impressed as I was. And I was more like hoping not to tell them what they should do with this. That was never, I mean, I ended up, my dad tried to do some interpretation for them as what it could mean. And they thought that was interesting. But what I was really hoping more for was, hey, you guys have capacity. Hopefully you have athletes, you have time, and you have resources. Go collect the data. you go collect the data. I can't collect the ski data for you. I'm not gonna be able to get it. But that was an epic fail. That did not go over that well. So, but there's a couple of studies that have gone out with NIRS and skiing. I know one in my head. I don't really remember. I know there's one at least that got published. Yeah. But so that's one of the things that happens over and over. I had since we put it on, and some guy playing tennis. Well, then it goes up and it goes down, it goes up and it goes down, and I'm like, okay, yeah. And then it's like, well, what am I going to do with this? And I'm like, well, we need to think about what you want to do with this, right? And then, but some we did find some interesting things. So we had two guys, and you would see, for example, the one guy SMO2 recovery curve was much faster. He'd go to serve again, and his SMO2 was like way up again already. And the other guy much slower. And the coach kind of said, yeah, they do feel like the one guy needs more recovery, And then one of my comments then was maybe strategically this helps. You need to slow down when you serve again. You got to pull the Nadal, right? And like 20 times do this and this, and kind of take as much time on before every service. That's where, and kind of figure out why is the one guy's recovery faster than yours? What are the training differences? Is this just genetics? Yeah. So that's another kind of example where those things happen.
When you're assessing, maybe going into the weeds a little bit for people that don't have a Moxy, but I'll go there anyway because it's my podcast. I do what I want. When you're collecting data on such things as change of direction and maybe strength work that are much shorter, you're looking for much shorter variations. Would you set the Moxy on the 0.5 update rate instead of the 2-second update rate with smoothing, or do you usually stay with the 2-second setting?
Yeah. So if you're doing real short things like we did with the climbers, you have to set it to the high one. And even then, it's not enough. So we definitely have some sampling rate problems with the climbers, because if they do 3-second rests and you're doing at the 2 hertz, you get 6 data points, which isn't that much to do an analysis of. So, and then if you have some errors in something, or you're missing some data points, or it's just not as clear the trend, and it's difficult, for sure. I do think we're interested in getting something with 10 hertz. I think that would be nice for a lot of different functions. But if you can manage, like if you're doing things that are 10 seconds or longer, I would probably just stay with the default mode, because it also makes you go a little bit less crazy because the data just looks cleaner. So I would definitely stick to the default unless you really need that resolution. One of the things that's important if you stick to default, and this is where it's a little bit of a handling, getting to know your device, getting to know how it responds. So yes, SMO2 responds very quickly, but there's the sampling rate and the smoothing make an artificial delay. Okay, so there's going to be a certain real physiological delay, and there's going to be like a made up device delay. And so when you're really trying to pinpoint times, it's going to take a little bit of playing, like the athlete being able to realize how the signal responds. So if you tell your athlete, for whatever reason, hey, I want you to do sprint intervals, but whatever, I don't want you to ever plateau at the bottom. I want you to, I would never want to see a plateau. I think that's bad. Then the athlete has to kind of get a feeling, because what will happen is they'll go and go and go and go and go and go. And then when they stop, you'll create a plateau or something like that might happen. So, because of the delay. So I think that takes a little bit of time to get that feel for that delay. It's similar to, again, like heart rate. If you start running, you're going to have to wait to see what happens. And now it's not quite that long, but you do have a little bit of a delay there that you need to deal with.
Yeah. So I guess if you are dealing with shorter effort times, then you can put it on the 0.5, and then you can smooth the data yourself after the fact. But even that will probably give you a better resolution than the what is it, 0.5 hertz if it's every 2 seconds.
Yeah, half hertz. Yeah.
Half hertz. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. So that's I guess that's good. That's good to know, because I was, like you said, I've noticed the slight delay that there is. I've been using the VO2 Master app, waiting for the Moxy Portal, and you do see that it doesn't respond right away, but
Mhm.
it does if you just look at I guess the beginning and the end, and then obviously there's
Mhm.
like that 2 or 3 second delay on everything. But like you said, the smoothing and the update rate makes that happen. Moving forward here, I wanted another thing I've been really thinking about and fascinated about recently is just the different interactions that happen between those physiological systems. So the respiratory, cardiovascular, muscular, metabolic, as well as maybe the central governor, the brain within those three different systems. When I mentioned those four systems, which interactions fascinate you the most or interest you the most in terms of how maybe the heart relates to the lungs, or the lungs relates to the muscle, or the brain relates to the lungs, et cetera, et cetera?
Cool. um, I mean, I guess I use NIRS. I'm always interested how those systems all relate to the muscles because I'm measuring in the muscles. I think that's generally what most of my work, and I mean that's where the performance output's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's also where it's an interesting um, the kind of peripheral or central limitation or barriers in physiological discussion. So, are you peripherally limited or central limited? And, are your muscles just always going to work as hard as they can all the time? Or is there going to be like a central governor that slows them down? I do think those are interesting. I mean, because they have real world effects, right? I mean, assuming I'm not sure how much it would actually change your training per se if you're trying to outsmart, or not, that's wrong, or kind of develop your central governor limitation, or develop like whatever the max would be. The central governor just doesn't allow you to go to the max, right? But I mean, I don't know how much of a real world change it has in how you're going to do your training. I mean, some of the maybe the real world things are that respiration becomes really important all of a sudden. All of
Mm-hmm.
a sudden you realize respiration can limit you, and it limits you because of a central protective mechanism, and not because, um, I mean, not because your muscles are somehow going 110%. Those things are all interrelated, anyways. So I do think that's interesting. I'm not sure if that answers your question, though.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's your answer is whatever it is. I don't get
Yeah.
to decide if it's if it's fitting or not. No, that makes sense. It's like you said. Maybe that's the most maybe elusive aspect of all this is how the brain interacts with those different systems and modulates their maybe output or restricts their output in different ways. To again, I guess it all goes back down to survival and preserving the organism itself and making sure that we don't do something so stupid that it might compromise the whole system in and of itself, right?
Yeah, and I mean, there's some debate about the central governor, I guess. I do think generally it's trending in that direction. And I think a lot of at least the critique that I've read of the central governor model, for me, is a little bit semantics, in that, everyone then agrees, um, of course, you have protective mechanisms that are controlled through your central nervous system that are going to that's going to protect your system. Everyone's like, yeah, of course. I mean, you have that with hypothermia. You have all these, and that's somehow related to your brain, your central nervous system. And then it goes into, but the way NOACS describes the central governor exactly in detail, that, that's kind of like that. We don't think that's true. I'm like, well, does it matter then? I mean, it's like, okay, maybe NOACS isn't perfect on the way that he describes it, but the general idea that you have a mechanism that is here to protect you, and one of those protective states will take place at maximal exercise intensity because it can be dangerous. That just makes sense. And then it's about finding out how those mechanisms work.
Mm.
And I think like Dempsey's work shows that there's something like that. I think again, Noakes does a lot of work of showing changes in or not showing changes in expected cardiac function with like changing altitudes. He's got work on that. So I definitely think there's something there. I just I mean, there's lots of interesting things about like the way the brain affects. So, for example, we talked about critical power, I think on last time. So there's a study that shows that if you do mentally fatiguing tasks, like Stroop tasks, they will not have an effect on your critical power, but they have an effect on your W prime.
Mm.
It lowers your W prime if you do mentally fatiguing tasks beforehand. Now, you can always talk about, well, what was the design, like what was the percent, but it's an interesting finding, right? That this brain is somehow affecting how much you can push. And those are the kind of come in together, right? This as the brain being a system that's obviously somehow important. And this specific example is relevant because it's not even the brain limiting in the sense of this physiological governor. It's like the brain limiting it in the sense of like cognitive fatigue, which is in itself interesting, especially if you're like in a team sport, right? Something that's cognitively demanding that you're saying, well, this is having an effect, and what does this mean?
I'm gonna just quickly cut you off because it brings to mind. I'm gonna butcher it because I don't remember the study exactly, but I think it's in Thinking Fast and Slow from Daniel Kahneman, which I think was a great book on how on some of the biases and the different heuristics that the brain operates through. And there was a study where I believe there was some math involved prior to, and then people were put in a room between, and there was like celery sticks on one side and chocolate cakes on the other, or something like that. And the group that had done the mentally challenging tasks beforehand for an extended period of time, or no, I think it was the other way around. They were put in the room and they were told that they weren't allowed to eat the food that was there. And I think one group was with the chocolate and one group was with the celery. And then they all went to do a mentally challenging task, like a math questionnaire or something. And people that were previously in the chocolate room decided to give up sooner than the other ones on the math test. It was something like that. And I guess it would go along with what you were just saying here, that you only have a certain battery of maybe, I don't know, drive, determination, ability to restrict your own, I don't know, urges, and then one of them being stopping when something's really hard and difficult, and that would go along with what you just said, and show the importance maybe of the going in another direction here, but the psychological aspect of performance itself, and how your essentially your mental state can affect your performance directly.
Yeah. I mean, this is something where I'm way off, like way outside of my depth here, because I don't do any of that psychology stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think there's a reason why sports psychology is increasing in popularity, for sure. Now, I maybe it's because I'm a physiologist, so I'm biased, but I do think that sports psychology and nutrition, sports nutrition, there's a lot more of like, there's a lot of that out there where I'm very skeptical. And so I think there's less of that in actual performance physiology, in my opinion.
Do you think it's because there's more stuff that's quantifiable and tangibly measurable, where in the nutrition, I guess that for me, nutrition is such a fascinating field, but infinitely complex due to the fact that no two people are going to respond the same to a given protocol, which is, you could extend that to training, but in a way with less magnitude, in the sense that there's going to be some general guidelines that you're going to be able to follow when it comes to exercise prescription and what adaptations or effects you're going to have on an organism. Whereas with the nutrition, again, from one person to the next, you might see something completely different. And even within the same person, on a time scale of a few months or a few years, you might see something completely different within the same individual. Then we talk about gut flora and then how that evolves over time, and then all of those other factors. And so maybe there's a lot less, it's a lot less, maybe there's no standard maybe, or not as much of a standard as there is in physiology. Would you say that that's the case?
Yeah, so I agree with that. Now I stand to be corrected. I mean, maybe some nutritional scientists, what are you talking about? We all agree on, so maybe my problem is that, in physiology, I'm more in the actual, let's say, heart of the science area, whereas nutrition stuff, I'm much more in the pop nutrition, and then I'm like, what are these guys even talking about? Whereas if I was actually a nutritional scientist, I would, there's a big chance that I'm just wrong on what I'm saying. Same with the sports psychology stuff. But I also think that those are maybe a little bit younger disciplines. Maybe they're harder to do rigorous empirical studies on, and human physiology is already not always so easy to do rigorous studies on because of complications and confounding factors. So I think that's probably a combination of all those things. That content, but to the point being is I think both are super important, right? So I'm not downgrading them. I just think they are very important and they deserve to be, to have the growing popularity, or let's say the growing importance for athletes in these fields, that athletes want information about these things is legitimate. It's just about getting them the right information, right? So, and I get asked all the time about nutrition stuff. People are like, oh, you're a sports scientist. And they ask me nutrition stuff. And I'm just like, keto? I don't know. So it's just not my, not my area. I have an opinion on these things, but I tend to be conservative in voicing it because I don't really know what I'm talking about.
No, that makes sense. Last thing I wanted to talk about with you today, Andrew, was a little experiment that I did. I believe it was yesterday, and I posted on the Moxy forum. So I did the Wim Hof breathing protocol, which consists of, or at least from what I could find online, because I haven't followed the course, I haven't read all the material, so I'm not super well versed in the thing. I just know what to do, and then I wanted to measure these effects, measuring with Moxys and with pulse ox as well, to see the different interactions between SpO2, SMO2, and then the breathing. And so essentially, for those who don't know the protocol, it's 30 deep breaths. You do this lying down, so you're fully rested. No physical activity. You're lying down because it's safer, especially if you want to see very low SpO2 values where you could topple over. So 30 deep breaths followed by a breath hold after the exhale. And you can repeat that a few times in time. And so for those who are interested, I'll put the link to the thread that I started on the forum in the show notes for you to go check out the graph and what came out. And Andrew, you mentioned just before we started recording that you had a quick look at it, and that you maybe had a couple of points to pull out of the graph. So I was interested to hear your thoughts. I know it's a hot take. It's a hot take. I didn't give you much time to look at the information, but essentially what I pulled out of what I saw was that I had a Moxy on my bicep, one on my intercostals, and I had an SpO2 as well on my finger. And what I saw is that SMO2 in the bicep and the intercostals were following a fairly similar trend in terms of desaturation after about 30 seconds of breath hold. So oxygen was starting to be used there at a faster rate than it was being delivered, and SpO2 was starting to drop at that point as well. The interesting thing for me was in the THB, where there was a fairly significant fluctuation in volume in the bicep, but not in the intercostals. I don't know if you see the same thing, or if we would interpret it the same. And I had a little theory behind it, and I was wondering if you had something similar or maybe a different point of view on it.
Yeah, so just if it's irritating to people, I'm looking at the screen behind me, which is the graph opens. I just opened that up right now so I can look at it. So please, it's not rude. I'm not I'm trying to look at the graph as well. So a couple things, the breathing, I had a couple of questions of the breathing, because I know Wim Hof, who he is, but I don't know any of the techniques either. You do the 30 breaths, and those are like in 30 seconds or in like a minute, or how long does it take? Like, what's the rate of breathing?
Yeah, so it's about 25 breaths a minute. Okay. I did instead of doing 30, I did 90 seconds, which came out to about 35 breaths, I think, between 35 and 40. Just because on my graph, it was then easier to track what was going on. So I extended that just a little bit, but essentially you're over breathing because you're at rest, and you take a deep breath in through the nose, a deep breath out through the mouth, and you repeat that for that duration. And so that, I guess from what I'd heard in the past was that, oh, you're going to over oxygenate your blood and get more oxygen in, and that's going to allow you to hold your breath for a longer time. And what I've come to understand, and I think that's the case, as you overbreathe at rest, you're actually, you can't oversaturate your blood because you're already at between 97 and 99 at rest anyway. And so what's going on when you overbreathe is you exhale more CO2 than you usually would, which lowers your CO2 levels, which means when you hold your breath, now you have more time before you reach your CO2 threshold or your ventilatory threshold. That forces you to take an inhale back in, and that's what allows you to hold your breath for longer. And the next step to that is that since you're able to hold your breath for longer than you usually would be able to because of that lower CO2 level, now you're able to get your SpO2 to drop significantly as a result of that. So that's kind of what I got out of it. And obviously that's only looking at that aspect of it. I know there's many other claims to the benefits of this type of breathing, which I don't want to get into here because I don't feel like I'm educated well enough on those points. But so that's kind of what I got out of it.
Yeah, and so just one of the things. So after you do the 30 breaths, then you do the breath hold. So then you do 30 breaths, then you hold your breath, and then after whatever.
I think I did 1 minute, 1.5 minutes, and 2.5 minutes. Then you take just the breath in, because you do the breath hold on an exhale. And I guess that makes sense from the standpoint of having your diaphragm in a relaxed position. Because if you were to do it on an inhale, now you have to keep your diaphragm contracted the whole time. Where if you do it on the exhale, then you're relaxed. And so, and after that, essentially when you can't hold your breath anymore, they tell you to take one big breath in and hold that for another 15 or 30 seconds. So that's kind of noted on the graph as well with the little line.
Okay. Yeah. I see. That's a breath in then. So basically you're breathing, and then you've fully exhaled and you hold, then you do one breath in.
You got it. Okay.
I mean, it's interesting because like, for example, a lot of breath holding techniques are also you hold on the inhaled, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, and the advantage of that is then you can exhale CO2, right?
Yeah.
Maybe on your one point that kind of using this hyperventilation thing to get into kind of a hypocapnic situation where you start your overbreathing resulting in your CO2 going down. What CO2 is a strong like breath reflex mechanism. So, and that happens as your CO2 accumulates. So if you start at a lower point, that is going to make sense. You're going to be able to push that out longer, right? Which is the same thing as if you were to breath hold in, and then after 30 seconds, you slowly start releasing. That also helps because it lets you get rid of some CO2. So it drops your CO2 levels down again. So you start feeling better again. So you do a breath hold within and you hold it for 30 seconds and you're like, oh my God. And then you start breathing out a bit. All of a sudden you feel like, this is not so bad. So you get this because of the feedback system that happens. So that all makes sense is what you're saying with what you would expect. What's also interesting is that you would expect this to happen, but you can kind of see it is that the magnitude of change in your SMO2 and in your SpO2 are actually somewhat similar, right? They're both on the scale of 0 to 100%, right? And if you were to overlap them, you'd have a bit of a more drop in SMO2 than SpO2, but the difference isn't that much. Okay. And this is also would be to expected is that the change, a lot of the change that's happening here is a decrease in supply of oxygen, and it's not an increase in demand of oxygen because you're at rest. The demand should stay the same essentially if you can do it right. There's probably going to be some reaction going on, so you might have a little bit more, but overall you'd expect most of this change, those things to mirror each other, which it does very nicely in your data as well, which is good. And 64% is pretty low. I bet you were feeling pretty good on
honestly, I was okay. I needed to breathe a little bit, but otherwise I had a little bit of tingling in my fingers, but nothing. I've gone down, I've done it before and I've gone down to 59, I think, %.
Mm,
And I didn't feel anything special. So I don't know if it's because I was,
yeah.
fully at rest or lying down, but honestly, I felt
Yeah.
fine. Yeah.
Maybe this is also a good show, a practical demonstration about the relevance of athletes having exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia. So when athletes lose SpO2 or like arterial saturation during exercise, which
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah.
So I mean, they get down to 90%, they get down to 88%, something like that.
I've seen
And you
85.
see that, yeah, and you see that this is directly mirrored in what's happening in your muscles.
Mm.
So if you're all of a sudden you're from the start already down 10%. I mean, that's a lot of oxygen that you're down, which is just because you're not being able to get it in.
Mm.
So it's a pretty strong argument for, hey, I need to do something about making sure that my arterial oxygen saturation stays up. It should not drop. So I think your example shows that nicely, that those two things are interrelated directly like that.
Mm.
Well, that makes sense for everyone without seeing the graph. And you maybe to the theory, I think the theory you're talking about you had is that, well, the intercostal THB stays relatively flat and you get this much higher fluctuation in your bicep. And this kind of goes back to the central governor that we were talking about before.
Mm.
That you might, if the system is perceiving a collapse, it's gonna make alterations in peripheral muscles rather than like an intercostal, which is linked to respiration itself. And your data would kind of show this. It looks nice. I think that would definitely be an argument that I would make looking at this data as well.
Mm.
I think that is definitely something that is showing. The overbreathing too. So because of the hemoglobin dissociation curve, it's something that my dad talked about lots, and he uses it a lot to interpret the Moxy data. And I'm sure anyone who's read through the forum will use these arguments as well. Is that you also see that when you're doing the overbreathing, so you're hypercapnic, it's going down. So you shift the hemoglobin dissociation curve in a way that favors oxygen uploading and doesn't favor oxygen unloading. So you get this big increase in SMO2, which is also going to be useful for like exercise after, right? This idea of hyperventilating before doing your exercising, to kind of like prime your system. There's quite a few studies about system priming anyways from Andy Jones has a bunch of stuff out there. I'm not sure if you're aware, but like high intensity bouts prior to your competition for priming.
Right.
And what you also see with like Moxy, you see big overshoots that happen if you do like these high intensity works, and you track your SMO2 data. So you can look at that. And then what happens is as soon as you start your breath holding, well, now CO2 is accumulating, and you're going to have the hemoglobin dissociation curve will shift in favor of unloading. Okay. I mean, you're also not getting any oxygen, so it's a mix of these two things. Of what's happening. So like one of the things that I've done with like breath holding is if you do breath holding with like you do an inhale and you hold for 30 seconds and you do an inhale and you exhale for the 30 seconds, you see a much stronger change in THB, at least from the data studies that I've done, if you are not exhaling. Whereas if you're exhaling, the system's much more stable because you don't go hypercapnic. So that's something maybe you could try it yourself as well. Like try it do the whole thing about like trying to hold and one with exhaling and then that kind of gets you into a system where you're assessing, well, how the CO2 is affecting your data.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. Is there anything you see? Is anything else you see? Sorry. Yeah.
I mean, I'm probably gonna have to write back in this thread at some point in time.
I'll put the link.
I hope someone else writes back first. I don't know. I think I said most of the things that I think is interesting.
Yeah.
Is there something that you have specifically you want me to comment on? I think the data just looks really nice. I mean, if I were to draw this data, this is kind of what I would draw. So.
Yeah, no, it's not expecting anything specific, and I think it's the O2 dissociation curve point that you added in is interesting as well, because it, like you said, it helps maybe see why that SMO2 increases during the overbreathing, and then as it goes back down. And like you said, there's probably some other playing around that can be done with those different parameters. The next thing I want to try and do, I'll add that to the developer forum, but one thing I'd like to do as well is, or see as well for the portal, is to be able to hook up a Bluetooth pulse ox, so be able to have that data overlaid on the Moxy data or the NIRS data, because right now it's just the pulse ox on my finger, and I have to look at the number while I'm doing it. But I know that there's some Bluetooth ones, and I want to try and connect one to the VO2 Master app to see if it works, and maybe having that info for people who don't have the ventilatory data. I think that's a good add-on to have, especially if you're doing a 515. It's good to assess what's going on that side of things. So I'll definitely have to add that onto the forum.
I have one more thing I got to add now that I'm looking at this data more. So one thing that's interesting is, because you do the breath in, you never do a breath out on your breath hold, right?
No.
You just take a breath in.
Yeah.
And what you see it much nicer in the second and in the third one, which are longer, is that you get a rebound in SMO2. It's expected to be with the breathe in. But you also get a rebound in THB. And so if your THB is decreasing, if these THB changes are somehow directly related to CO2, which to a certain extent they probably are, what's interesting is that the breath in is definitely having an effect. Now, the assume would be that you haven't actually gotten rid of any CO2, right?
Yeah, it's still there.
Right. So one of the things that does happen is that so if we're measuring in the capillaries, and we were talking about like the non-linearity of these things, is that you might have, because red blood cells, they don't move linearly into microcirculation, so you might have more or less that move in. So but in theory with Moxy, we would be measuring that non-linearity. We would see that that's happening. So it could be that with the breath in and the big refreshing of oxygen, that you might be changing hematocrit levels at the measurement site, which is in itself interesting when I'm looking at this. It's kind of cool. That's all I have to say. Just that's one of the things that I noticed right now, that that's something that's happened, because your THB, what's happening in your THB is repeated in each one.
Yes.
It's like the same thing's happening in each one, right? With the breath hold, it goes up. With the breathing, it goes up. The breath hold, it goes down. And then when you breathe in, you get this bump up every time after the breathe in, or around the breathe in. So, it might also have something to do with getting really low, at some point getting really low SpO2 levels. There might be something like the Huntington's reflex, where it's just trying to keep it alive as long as it can. It doesn't want things to die off. So, okay, I'm gonna leave it there before I get stuck in that's it.
No, I like it. Thanks for adding all this in. Andrew, it was great to have you back on the show. For people who want to learn more about everything that you do, where can they find more information?
I got two things. So one is that you can write me an email at Andri Feldmann. You check me out at the University of Bern website. I have a YouTube channel. It's called NIRS Sport Science. It has my email at the end. Maybe you can put that in the link below.
It will
try to put videos up once in a while. People can contact me there. And and I was going to show one more thing, actually. I'm going to take liberty to show, but this is something we've been working on for a while. And so if people are interested, they should definitely write me an email. But we have check this out.
Oh, shorts with, this is good. So it's for people who are just listening on the audio, it's a pair of compression shorts with room for the Moxy sensor. This is fantastic. You know what? I've been thinking about this recently. Yeah. And for people listening here, Andrew's showing how you can just pop the Moxy on the light shield that is embedded
Sorry, I'm dropping it.
That is
It's
embedded
easy. It's
inside
easy.
the shorts. That is really cool. I like that. I've been thinking
Yeah.
about, some kind of maybe Velcro strap with just the room for the Moxy to pop out that you can easily put on a leg instead of having to tape it every time, because the tape costs an arm and a leg.
Yeah. Of course.
No, this is
So
really cool. So, are you doing this? Is Moxy doing this? Who's making those compression shorts?
yeah. So it's a company's a pro company's making it. So we're not making shorts. So we don't know how to make shorts. It's got Q365.
Okay.
They're a partner. They make cycling gear. So really high quality stuff.
Yeah.
And so this has been developed for a little while with lots of testing to make sure, the kind of location specificity and that the device doesn't move too much. Works pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And we're definitely send me an email. And if you're interested in getting shorts, and we're looking at doing kind of maybe a large scale order at some point in time, if we get enough people that want shorts. But it's definitely something we look at to hopefully get a sale just going, that people just order these online, because I think it takes one of the barriers away. So definitely, anyone watching who's interested, write me an email. The more positive feedback we get, the more likely we're going to get these out quickly.
No, this is really great. So for everybody listening and watching, I'll put Andri's email and YouTube channel link inside the show notes. So go write him an email. If you use a Moxy and you're going to need a pair of shorts, then definitely go for that, because it's going to save you a lot of tape and probably a lot of trouble as well, just putting the sensor exactly in the right spot every time. So I think that's a great addition to the toolkit for anybody using Moxy. Thanks for showing that.
There you go.
No, great to have you on again, man.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Sean. All right.
Talk soon.
See you later. Yeah.